The sun over Naxos does not merely shine. It bakes the white marble dust of the harbor until the air shimmering above the docks smells of scorched stone, drying kelp, and the intoxicating fermented musk of overripe grapes. It is the second day of Bodromion, the 2nd of September, and the Aegean is a sheet of beaten silver, a mirror reflecting a sky so blue it feels heavy. I shift the weight of the willow basket against my hip. For 3 days I have been a fixture of the agora, my skin absorbing the sense of my father's trade. We are not of the landed elite, but our house is built on the sturdy foundations of the merchant class, thriving on the pulse of the harbor. My fingers still feel the phantom texture of the wares I've been hawking. Heavy, translucent carnelian beads that catch the light like drops of blood, and the sea silk harvested from giant clams, shimmering with an iridescent gold that no dye can replicate. Father had me draped in the finest imports from the Far East to lure the passing crowds, silks so light they felt like a second skin, patterned with strange, swirling clouds that seemed to move when I breathed. I stood there, a living mannequin for the wealthy matrons of Naxos, turning this way and that to show how the fabric caught the light, pitching the rarity of the weave while my soul was already miles away at the shoreline. This morning, seeing the restless tap of my sandal against the dirt, Father finally relented. He took the ledger from my hand with a gruff laugh.
Go, Ilara. Ariadne doesn't favor a maiden who spends her festival counting drachmas. Tell your friends the jewelry sells better when you aren't scowling at the customers.
The path to the Gove is a gauntlet of heat, lined with silver-leaved olive trees and the occasional jagged outcrop of granite. As we crest the final dune, the beach unfolds like a prayer answered. The sand here isn't the fine white powder of the southern reaches, but a warm pebbled gold that crunches underfoot. The shore is alive today because of the Ariadne. The island feels as though it's exhaling. Further down the coast, fishermen are hauling in their final nets before the evening's revelry, their bronzed backs gleaming with sweat. Children, brown as chestnuts and completely naked, shriek as they chase the receding foam while the group of older boys are further out, diving from a jagged rock promontory into the crystalline deep.
If you walk any faster, Ilara, we shall have to pour out a libation for Chloe's departed spirit.
I stop and turn, a grin breaking across my face. Agatha is marching towards me, her stride long and arrogant. She is a striking, sharp-edged girl with skin the color of polished mahogany and a nose as straight as a sculptor's line. Her dark curls are bound back with a leather cord, though several stubborn strands have escaped to frame a face that is perpetually set in a look of bold defiance. She is beautiful in a way that demands you notice it, her pride practically radiating off her like heat from the sand. Dragging behind her is Chloe, the softest of our trio. She is pale for a girl of the islands, with wide, doe-like eyes and a soft roundness to her cheeks that she constantly tries to hide behind her tresses. She is clutching her own small satchel, her head ducked as Agatha loudly critiques the physique of a passing sailor hauling a crate of amphorae.
I told you.
Agatha calls out, giving me a playful, heavy-handed shove as they reach me.
She's already planning how she's going to dance her way to the inner circle of the festival tonight. Look at her eyes. She's already halfway to the stars with her goddess.
I don't deny it. I look at the northern cliffs where the myths say Theseus crept away like a thief in the night, leaving a princess to her grief. People call it a tragedy, but I see it as a transformation. Ariadne didn't die of a broken heart. She woke up on our Naxos and found a god waiting to crown her with the heavens. I feel that tether to her, the sense that something wild and divine is waiting just past the horizon if you're brave enough to stay behind. I have the picnic, I say, lifting the basket to show the damp fig leaves covering our lunch. I've packed it with the pride of a Naxian merchant, a heavy wedge of salty, crumbly goat's cheese, roasted barley cakes speckled with black sesame, wrinkled olives cured in brine, and a flask of wine diluted with spring water and sweetened with wild thyme honey. The water in the cove is turquoise, turning to a bruised purple where the shelf drops off into the deep. It's that perfect, late summer heat, where the sea is the only thing that makes the skin feel whole again. The sea is waiting. The festival starts at sundown, and today, I say, looking from the shy Chloe to the boisterous Agatha. We belong to nobody but ourselves. I kick off my sandals, feeling the hot gold of the sand between my toes, and begin to run towards the foam. I'm Courtney.
And I'm Zai, filling in for this week for Brandon. Welcome to the Time Travelers Club Beach Day Special. Alright, travelers, the last 2 weeks have been thrilling, but a bit serious, even heavy at times. We've been in the thick of it with ancient German warrior culture, war, ancient and powerful magic, incredibly complex discussions on gender and identity, and last week we talked about the painfully relatable transition of the Roman Republic to Empire with our humble history boy, Jerry Nash from the History Boys. We hate to say it, but it's not going to get any easier from here, though you could say that we have a bonfire to look forward to after our beach day.
That is a bad joke. That is a terrible joke given the trajectory of this season.
So with that being said, today we're about to give ourselves the stereotypical anime trope of a beach day episode together before heading into a much darker adventure. You know the one. And usually this is the last time you see one of the characters and everyone is happy before some terrible and earth-shattering happens to said character. None of us may ever be the same after that. I can't do an anime voice. But that's tomorrow. Let's just enjoy this moment, and I know that together we will get through it. So, what does a beach day look like in antiquity exactly? Honestly, a lot of it would feel familiar. The crowds, the social performance of it all, the food you probably shouldn't be eating before 10 in the morning, the very specific anxiety of not knowing how deep it gets. Except, and here's the thing, depending on which ancient you are, your relation to that water is completely different. An Egyptian princess learned to swim in a private palace pool as part of her royal education, because in Egypt, swimming was a sign of refinement. Many Greek soldiers could swim in full armor because Plato basically said that a man who couldn't swim was as uneducated as one who couldn't read. And some people in the ancient world genuinely believed that getting in the water at all was a violation of the natural order, that swimming was for fish. And they wrote that down, seriously, in religious texts, and then they went home entirely dry.
So I do want to add a note at the mention of Plato and saying that a man who couldn't swim basically couldn't read either. Mm-hmm. There is actually a connection in the brain between certain movements and intellectual thought. And in the development of children, if kids miss the step of crawling, they actually can't read. So with how you do swim, most of the time, it kind of looks like a crawl in the water. So I really do think that there is a connection to that. He might not have understood it in his time period.
Yeah.
But he's not wrong.
I would not have known that. The beach, it turns out, has always been the place where culture gets weird. Today on the Time Travelers Club, we are packing our bags, slathering on the castor oil, and spending a day at the water with the ancient world. We've got Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, a mosaic that may be the oldest bikini on record, and one resort town that is now, I cannot stress this enough, literally underwater, which is the most poetic possible ending for the Las Vegas of the Roman Empire. So grab your towels, make sure your bikini strings are tied tight, everyone. We don't want any fan service moments on this show, and let's go.
I don't know. I might give a little fan service, but...
Okay, before we get to the beach parties, we need to talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, which is the fact that for a big stretch of human history, swimming was genuinely politically loaded, in a way we've completely forgotten about. We tend to think of swimming as a pretty neutral life skill. You either know how to do it or you don't, and if you don't, maybe someone signs you up for lessons and that's the end of it. But in the ancient world, who swam, who didn't, and what that said about you, that was a whole conversation, a loud one. The divide ran roughly along the lines of who lived near the sea versus who didn't. But it was more complicated than that, because even coastal peoples had wildly different relationships with actually getting in the water. The Phoenicians were master mariners who sailed Britain and West Africa, but swimming recreationally wasn't really part of their culture. The sea was a workspace, not a playground. Many Romans lived within reach of the coast their entire lives and never learned to swim at all, which the Greeks found genuinely baffling and a little shameful. Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube were noted by Roman observers as strong swimmers who crossed rivers in full armor and thought nothing of it, while Roman soldiers often had to be ferried across those same rivers in boats. And then you have the Egyptians, who had a robust swimming culture going back thousands of years. There's a hieroglyph for swimming that appears in the text from the Old Kingdom around 2500 BCE, but whose relationship with their water was so thoroughly saturated in religious meaning that it operated on a completely different level from anything the Greeks and Romans were doing. The other thing worth noting at the beach itself as a concept, a dedicated leisure space at the water's edge, is actually a fairly modern invention. For most of human history, the shoreline was a working environment, a place for fishing, shipbuilding, trade, and military operations. The idea that you would go to the beach specifically to relax, to be seen, to eat food you didn't need, and to float around doing nothing useful, that's a luxury that required a certain level of economic surplus and social stability to even be possible. The Romans got there, the Etruscans got there before them. Most of the ancient world was doing something considerably more purposeful on the sand. So let's go through them, culture by culture, and see what a day at the water actually looked like.
So, first we go to Egypt. The first thing to understand is that an Egyptian beach day looked nothing like what you're probably picturing. There's no salt water, no crashing waves, no Mediterranean coastline. For most of the pharaonic history, the coast, what Egyptians called the Great Green, was a marshy, storm prone frontier that foreigners kept invading through. The Delta was a militarized zone, not a holiday destination. It was only during the Ptolemaic period, after Alexander's conquest in 332 BCE, that Alexandria emerged as a genuine coastal capital, blending Greek maritime culture with Egyptian monumentalism. Before that, the cultural concept of leisure bathing developed almost entirely inland. The real aquatic leisure scene was the Nile, the Delta canals, and the enormous Birket Koran Lake out in the Fayum Oasis, a lush freshwater depression in the western desert that had been a royal hunting and fishing ground since at least the Middle Kingdom. The Fayum in particular was something of an ancient resort. Middle and New Kingdom pharaohs maintained elaborate hunting lodges there, and the lake was stocked, to the degree that a naturally occurring ecosystem can be stocked, with Nile tilapia that the elite fished with spears and throw sticks from papyrus skiffs. The Fayum is also where we get some of our most vivid evidence of Egyptian waterfront leisure, including tomb paintings and papyrus texts describing exactly the kind of aristocratic river outing that we're talking about. Water in Egypt wasn't just water. And this is crucial to understanding why the Egyptian beach day had a character that it did. The Nile was Hapi, a divine living entity and the source of the annual inundation that deposited the rich black silt that made agriculture possible, and therefore made civilization possible. The flood was resurrection. Every year, the land died in the drought and was reborn when the water returned, and that cycle mapped directly onto the mythology of Osiris, whose death and resurrection was the central narrative of Egyptian religion. When an Egyptian noble stepped into the Nile, they weren't just cooling off. They were participating physically and symbolically in the most important story their culture knew. That is very different headspace than slapping on some SPF 50 and cracking open a can of White Claw.
No, but now I have that image in my head.
You're
The
welcome.
pharaoh just.
As you should. As you should. For the elite, A Day by the Water was a serious, carefully orchestrated production. We're talking temporary pavilions erected on the banks, held up by carved wooden columns painted to look like lotus stalks or papyrus umbels, the two plants most associated with Upper and Lower Egypt, respectively. Reed mats covered the ground beneath these structures, and servants continuously splashed them with water so the evaporation would cool the ambient air. This is genuinely clever engineering. It's the same principle as a swamp cooler. The ancient Egyptians figured out evaporative cooling roughly 4,000 years before anyone put it in a building. No, the AC units of the ancient world needs to be an entire episode because
Yes, that would actually be a really interesting episode.
the architecture, I love it so much, but I am a nerd.
Me too.
So wealthy men and women wore the finest, most translucent linen available, often pre-soaked to keep it cool against the skin as it dried. Egyptian linen at the high end was extraordinary stuff. So finely woven it was sometimes described as woven water, nearly invisible when held up to the light. Their bodies and intricately braided wigs were coated in scented oils, blue lotus blossom, myrrh, and frankincense. These weren't just perfume. They were functional, fat-based unguents that blocked UV radiation and kept insects off. But they were also devotional. The scent of lotus was specifically associated with solar rebirth and the morning emergence of the sun god Ra from the primordial waters. Smelling like lotus was, in a real sense, smelling like divinity. Wealthy guests sometimes wore solid cones of perfumed fat on top of their wigs, which would melt slowly throughout the day and run down their hair and shoulders. This sounds fairly unpleasant, disgusting, by modern standards, but it was a mark of luxury, and contemporary texts describe it as genuinely pleasant. I do also want to do an episode on ancient fabrics,
Hmm.
textiles, and everything, because we have lost so much in regards to them. And
Hmm.
the woven water specifically is, I think, I think there are a couple bolts that were still of like preserved,
Hmm.
but we can't do anything like that nowadays, which is so sad. It's so sad. So adults kept their swimming loincloths on in public social settings. Children, meanwhile, ran completely naked along the warm mudflats except for heavy protective amulets. Remember, this is the Nile River. Gold, or faience figures of Taweret, the fearsome hippopotamus goddess of childbirth and protection, and Bes, the bow legged dwarf deity who warded off malevolent forces. These weren't decorative. The Nile was full of actual crocodiles and actual hippopotami, both of which were genuinely dangerous, and the amulets were specific, earnest requests for divine intervention. We know from Egyptian medical texts that crocodile attacks on children were common enough to warrant dedicated spells of protection, which puts the mudflat picnic in a slightly different light. The centerpiece of activity of an Egyptian water outing was fowling and fishing from papyrus skiffs. Light, maneuverable watercraft designed to glide silently through the dense reed beds without disturbing the wildlife. The master of the house stood at the prow with either a curved wooden throw stick or a bronze tipped harpoon, aiming at startled flocks of pin-tailed ducks or the massive Nile tilapia that darted through the shallows. His family sat on cushions at his feet, draped in fresh lotus garlands, cheering his successes. This scene appears so frequently in Egyptian tomb paintings, and with such consistent compositional detail, that it was clearly one of the definitive images of aristocratic leisure, something worth preserving on your tomb walls as a picture of the good life you've lived and hoped to continue in the field of reeds. The famous painted limestone relief from the tomb of Nebamun in Thebes, now in the British Museum and dating to around 1350 BCE, shows this scene with extraordinary vividness. Nebamun standing on his skiff in a papyrus marsh, throwing stick raised, his wife and daughter seated at his feet, a cat hunting birds in the reeds beside him. It's one of the most beautiful things to survive from the ancient world, and it's essentially a painting of a day off. This wasn't purely recreational, though. Or rather, recreation and ritual weren't separate categories in the Egyptian worldview. The hunt in the marsh was symbolic enactment of Ma'at, cosmic order and justice, triumphing over a wild chaos of the natural world. The pharaoh hunted in the marsh for the same reason he trampled enemies underfoot. It was a performance of the fundamental Egyptian conviction that civilization, order, and divine sanction were always struggling against chaos, and always, with effort, winning. Even a nobleman's fishing trip was a small reenactment of that cosmic drama. Now, back under the pavilions, the older guests played Senet or Mehren, strategic board games with intricately carved ivory and ebony pieces, while servants poured pomegranate wine and thick barley beer strained through linen to remove the chaff. The food was what you'd expect from civilization that treated hospitality as a moral obligation: roasted waterfowl seasoned with coriander and sea salt, whole grilled tilapia stuffed with aromatic herbs, tiger nuts, lotus roots pulled fresh from the mud, green figs, dates, honey cakes shaped like hippos or gazelles, and musicians. They were playing dual reed pipes, long necked flutes, and portable arched harps. There were also trained swimmers, often young women performing what we'd essentially called synchronized swimming in the deeper, calmer channels. Their movements choreographed to evoke the undulations of river deities in the living current. This wasn't incidental entertainment. Water movement in Egyptian religious thought was the movement of divine energy through the world, and the swimmers were, in a very real sense, embodying the sacred. So more like a more like a dance that you would see at a temple in Japan,
Hmm.
but it's in the water, and so it's almost made to seem silly because it's in the water, but it has just as much gravitas.
Hmm.
The Egyptian approach to the beach was completely inseparable from religion and domestic magic, and that's what made it distinctive. The day wasn't divided into sacred time and leisure time. It was all one thing. A dip in the river was a micro enactment of solar rebirth. The mud you smeared on your skin contained the mineral essence of the Nile flood, the same substance that made the wheat grow. The lotus garland around your neck connected you to the mythology of creation. Even the food was coded. The tilapia was associated with Hathor and with sexual regeneration, the blue lotus with the resurrection of Ra. An Egyptian noble reclining on reed mats by the Nile wasn't just enjoying a day off. They were living inside of a story, the most important story their civilization had. And the beach was one of the places that story made itself the most physically present.
The Greeks had a completely different relationship with the beach, and it makes sense when you look at the geography. The Greek world was a fractured coastline, jagged peninsulas, deep inlets, thousands of islands scattered across the Aegean. The historian Plato noted that Greeks lived around the Mediterranean like frogs around a pond. Nobody's ever far from the smell of salt spray. But that familiarity didn't translate into comfort with the sea itself. The open water was the domain of Poseidon, famously capricious and prone to sending storms and sea monsters after people who annoyed him. The deep sea was unknowable, monster-filled, and actively dangerous. The shore was a boundary you could stand on, controllable, a place where the ordered world of Polis could project itself right up to the edge of chaos. A Greek beach day was fundamentally inseparable from civic and religious life, and the summer calendar made this explicit. The Poseidonia was a midsummer coastal festival dedicated to the Earthshaker himself, featuring authentic contests, musical competitions, and substantial animal sacrifice right on the beach. The Delia was a massive pan-Hellenic maritime pilgrimage to the tiny sacred island of Delos, the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, where brightly painted ships from across the Greek world converged, and the shores filled with thousands of pilgrims for choral performances, athletic games, and enormous hecatombs, the word for sacrifice of 100 cattle. Though in practice it often referred to any very large sacrifice rather than a literal 100. The smoke from burning thigh bones wrapped in fat dripped out over the Aegean. The beaches during the festivals were simultaneously athletic arenas, theaters, marketplaces, and temples. The modern idea of the beach as an escape from social obligations would have made no sense to a classical Greek. The beach was where your social obligations found their fullest expression. For young men, the beach was simply the outdoor extension of the gymnasium. Groups from the local gymnasia would march down together to rocky or pebbled beaches. Phaleron near Athens was a popular one, and the windswept coastline near Corinth saw its share of athletic activity. Strip entirely naked and coat themselves in olive oil mixed with fine sand.
That just sounds unpleasant.
It
All the
does,
sand, very gritty.
right?
Ew, no thank you.
It's like getting sand in your toes at the beach.
Ugh, no.
The sand added grip for wrestling and provided some protection against the salt that would otherwise crust painfully on the skin. Then they went at it. Pankration, the ancient Greek martial art that combined wrestling, boxing, and basically anything that didn't involve eye gouging or biting, though even those rules were loosely enforced, was practiced right at the waterline, the surf churning around the combatants. This was not recreational. It was military training conducted in a recreational setting with a distinctly Greek way to spend the holiday. Swimming was an absolute, non-negotiable baseline of Greek civilization. Plato states it directly in the Laws. A man who cannot read and cannot swim is uneducated. This is striking if you think about it. He's putting swimming in the same category as literacy, which was the foundational skill of civic participation. The reasoning was partly military. Greek naval power depended on rowers and marines who could survive a shipwreck, and the Greek world was full of shipwrecks. But it was also philosophical. Swimming represented the mastery of the human body over an indifferent and potentially fatal nature force. The waves didn't care about you. They had no reason to spare you. If you could not master them through discipline and physical training, you were demonstrating arete, that Greek concept of total excellence, moral and physical, that was the highest aspiration of the citizen. Beach time was spent perfecting the overarm stroke, cliff diving from a jagged coastal outcrops into the cold blue water below, and excuse me, and competing in the underwater endurance challenges. Who could dive deepest, who could hold their breath longest, who could retrieve the heaviest stone from the sea floor. These weren't idle games. They were the extension of the same ethos that produced the Olympics. The food on a Greek beach Let me try that again. The food on a Greek beach was deliberately austere, and the austerity was partly principled. Rock-hard barley bread, maza, dipped in seawater to soften and salted.
Blech.
That sounds disgusting.
It sounds vile, doesn't it?
I love some salty, soggy bread.
Blech. No, thank you.
Bitter wild olives, sardines caught that morning and charred over driftwood fires.
See, that's not bad.
That sounds good. Dried figs, goat's cheese wrapped in fig leaves to keep it from melting, wine diluted with spring water at a strict ratio, typically 3 parts water to 1 part wine, maybe 2 to 1 for a special occasion. Because maintaining intellectual clarity was more important than getting drunk, and because getting drunk was what barbarians did.
Ooh, barbarians.
I know, right? The Spartans, who had strong opinions about everything, maintained that the only acceptable reason to drink wine was to acquire the same taste for sobriety that comes from watching a drunk man make a fool of himself. They would allegedly bring helots, their enslaved agricultural workforce, to drinking parties and force them to drink to excess specifically so that a Spartan youth could observe the consequences.
That's fucked up.
That is fucked up. This is a profoundly grim teaching method, but it illustrates how seriously the Greeks took the question of what you put in your body and what that said about your character. While the young men destroyed each other on the surf, older citizens and philosophers gathered in the shade of olive trees and plane trees at the back of the beach, drinking their carefully diluted wine and arguing about whatever was currently tearing the city apart. The beach was, in this way, a democratic leveler. Stripped of heavy woolen cloaks and the visual markers of wealth and status, citizens interacted on roughly equal terms, their loud conversations punctuated by the waves. Political gossip, legal disputes, philosophical debates, all of it spilled down to the shore. There's a tradition in later sources of Socrates conducting philosophical dialogues in the beach at Phaleron, which makes a kind of sense. The liminal space of the shore between the ordered city and chaotic sea was a fitting place for conversations about where the boundaries of knowledge lay.
Women had a separate, highly regulated, and in some ways surprisingly rich relationship with the shore. The strict social geography of classical Greek cities confined freeborn women largely to the domestic sphere, the oikos, the household, with public movement restricted and monitored. But certain coastal religious festivals created specific exceptions. Sacred gatherings for Artemis, goddess of the wild, and Aphrodite, who was herself born from the sea foam off the coast of Cyprus, took place at secluded coves and remote beaches that were women-only spaces. During these festivals, citizens and their female attendants would gather to perform ritual washings of themselves and of the ancient wooden cult statues called zoana, which were some of the oldest and most sacred religious objects in the Greek world. Carrying a zoanon into the sea and washing it was a profound act of religious service, and it was women who performed it. These gatherings were, also, by all accounts, genuinely joyful. Women sang choral hymns, shared stories, and had the rare experience of being outside in the open air without the patriarchal gaze of the city. The poet Sappho, writing from the island of Lesbos in the 7th century BCE, describes women's ritual gatherings at the shore with a vividness and tenderness that suggests they mattered enormously to the people who participated in them, that they were genuine spaces of community and freedom in a society that offered women very few of either. It's worth pausing on that. For Greek women, the beach wasn't an extension of civic life, the way that it was for men, at least. It was an escape from it. And that escape was only possible because it was framed as religious obligation. The gods, in other words, provided the cover. The luxury of the Hellenic shore, such as it was, lay entirely in the landscape. The stark beauty of the white rock cliffs, the freezing clarity of the water, the philosophical weight of looking at the horizon that led, eventually, to the edges of the world. The Greeks understood that they were small, and the sea was enormous, and there was something important about standing at that boundary and not being destroyed by it. The beach was where you proved, repeatedly and physically, that you weren't going to be destroyed by it. That's a very different kind of beach day than the one that we're used to. But it's a coherent one, and in its own demanding way, it's a beautiful one. So now we go where we have not been before. In the ancient Far East, particularly during the Zhou, Han, and Tang dynasties in China and the Heian period in Japan, the beach was not a place you went to have fun in any sense a Roman would recognize. It wasn't about the body at all. It was about the mind, the spirit. and the very specific kind of productive melancholy that comes from sitting quietly at the edge of something vast and letting it work on you. To understand this, you have to understand the philosophical frameworks operating in the background. Taoism, which emerged as a coherent philosophy in China around the 4th century BCE but drew on much older traditions, held that the highest human aspiration was alignment with the Tao, the natural, effortless flow of the universe. Not the imposition of human will on the world, which was the Greek and Roman mode, but the deliberate dissolution of that will into the larger current of things. Water was the central metaphor of Taoist thought. Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching returns to water again and again. The highest good is like the water. Water benefits 10,000 things and does not compete. The river, the lake, the sea, these weren't challenges to be mastered or resources to be exploited. They were teachers. You went to the water to learn something about how to be in the world with less friction and more grace. Confucianism, running parallel to Taoism, and often in tension with it, added a different layer. For Confucian scholars, and Confucian scholars ran basically everything in Imperial China since the civic service examination system selected for Confucian learning, leisure was never truly separate from self-cultivation. Even a day away from court was an opportunity to refine the character, compose poetry, practice calligraphy, and demonstrate the kind of refined sensibility that marked you as a truly educated person. The beach outing in this context was a performance of cultivation. You went to the water not to escape your responsibilities, but to become more worthy of them.
The biggest waterfront event in the Chinese summer was the Danwu Festival, the Dragon Boat Festival, which fell on the 5th day of the 5th lunar month and transformed the trading rivers and estuaries into something completely different from their everyday selves. Long, narrow boats painted with dragon scales and fierce dragon heads, paddled furiously by teams of muscular men in perfect time to the booming of massive hide drums, racing down the river in organized heats. The origin story is one of the great tragic tales of Chinese history. Ku Yuan, a brilliant poet and loyal minister of the state of Chu, who was repeatedly slandered by political rivals and ultimately exiled by his own king. On the day he heard that his beloved state had fallen to the king, the state that would eventually conquer all of China, he walked into the Mailu River and drowned himself, clutching a large stone. Local fishermen raced out in their boats to try to save him, and when they couldn't, they beat their drums to drive away the fish and dropped rice dumplings into the water to keep the fish from consuming his body. The Dragon Boat Festival commemorates that rescue attempt every year, which makes it one of the more emotionally complex beach parties in human history.
That's an understatement.
Just a bit.
That's dark. That's so dark.
Calling it a beach party almost feels like wrong.
We can blame Brandon for that.
A communal act of grief and loyalty that has somehow survived for over 2,000 years and is still celebrated today. If you've ever seen a dragon boat race, you're watching an echo of fishermen desperately trying to pull a poet out of a river in 278 BCE. For the educated elite, though, the Dragon Boat Festival was actually something to flee. The noise, the crowds, the physicality and communal emotion of it, these were antithetical to the cultivation of inner refinement. What that class preferred was a quiet retreat to the shores of vast inland lakes like Taihu in the Yangtze Delta region, or the perpetually mist-shrouded estuaries where the rivers meet the sea. Taihu in particular had been a site of aesthetic pilgrimage since at least the Tang Dynasty. Its shores were dotted with limestone rocks, Taihu stones, that were prized by scholars and collectors for their strange, porous, wind-carved shapes, which were seen as miniature landscapes embodying the same principles of natural formation that Taoist aesthetics admired in full-scale mountains and rivers. A scholar's garden wasn't complete without one. The lake itself was subject of hundreds of poems, most of them preoccupied with mist, with the blurring boundaries between water and sky, with the impossibility of grasping the full extent of the view. The scholars brought writing desks, silk paper, inkstones, and fine animal hair brushes. They settled under weeping willows or twisted pines leaning out over the water and fished, except not really. The practice of gongfu fishing involved a bamboo rod, a line, and no hook, no bait. You were not going to catch anything. That was the point. The Taoist sage Jiang Jie, who supposedly fished this way for decades on the banks of the Wei River before being discovered by King Wen of Zhao and invited to serve as his advisor, became the archetype of the contemplative non-fisherman. His straight hook, a hook with no bend, catching nothing, became a philosophical symbol of acting without striving, of waiting in alignment with the universe rather than imposing a plan on it. For a Tang Dynasty scholar sitting on a rock by the Taihu with his hookless line in the water, this was the highest aspiration. Not catching a fish, becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to catch a fish.
I'm sorry. It sounds very pretentious.
A little bit.
No, a lot of bit.
The sensory experience of these retreats was carefully curated and intensely auditory. The lapping water on stones, the dry rustle of tall reeds, the lonely cry of distant birds. These were the ambient soundtrack, occasionally accompanied by the soft, mournful strings of the keen, the seven-string zither that was definitive instrument of the scholarly civilization. Keen wasn't played for entertainment. The keen wasn't played for entertainment or performance. It was played to harmonize the player's internal energy, their ki, with the energy of the surrounding landscape, chi. Their chi with the energy of the surrounding landscape. There's a famous story about the great keen player Yu Boya, who played by a river with only his friend Zhang Zikui could truly understand his music. Zhang Zikui hearing in the music, sometimes high mountains, sometimes flowing water. When Zhang Zikui died, Yu Boya smashed his keen and never played again because there was no one left in the world who could listen. The story illustrates how the Chinese understood musical performance at the water's edge, not as entertainment but as communion, as an attempt to complete understanding between the music, the musician, the landscape, and the listener. They gave me so many hard words. It's the Zong. This is a good reminder that I don't speak Chinese, so if I butcher these words, I apologize. The zongzi eaten during Dragon Boat Festival are one of the more delightful things to survive from the ancient world into the present. Dense, pyramid-shaped dumplings of glutinous, sticky rice, stuffed with sweet red bean paste or rich, fatty pork, lightly wrapped in bamboo or reed leaves and steamed for hours. They show up in Kuyan's own poetry, which is either historically accurate or a later interpolation to connect the food more firmly in his legend. Scholars disagree. They were washed down with Realgar wine, which was made with arsenic sulfide and was mildly toxic.
Mildly.
Mildly. Just a little bit of arsenic. This is a little bit.
It's fine. It's fine. You're good. We're
It's for flavor.
I mean, we're by the water's edge. Let's get poisoned. But
It was consumed specifically because it was believed to ward off snakes, summer diseases, and malicious water spirits. The logic was that anything strong enough to kill you in large doses must surely kill the things trying to kill you. So it's not great pharmacology, but it has a certain folk medical coherence. I guess. A little arsenic with your tea. On the quiet, scholarly retreat days, the menu was minimal and micro-seasonal. Warm rice wine heated over smokeless charcoal braziers, delicate white fish steamed with ginger and scallions, tart pickled sour plums, cold lotus rice sliced in precise mathematical cross-sections that showed the internal chambers of the root like a diagram. The consumption of this food was itself meditative, each element chosen to harmonize with the season, the landscape, the exact quality of the light on the water. Tang Dynasty poetry is full of this kind of precise sensory attention. The specific green of new willow leaves against gray water, the smell of rain on dry river stones, the difference in birdsong between early and late summer. The scholar at the water was paying attention in a way that the Roman at Baiae, drunk on Falernian wine and shouting at his moray eels, simply was not.
in Heian, Japan, the shore carried an even more specifically sacred charge. Rooted in foundational Shinto practice, Shinto understood the world as animated by kami, divine spirits present in all natural phenomena, but concentrated specifically in places of unusual power or beauty. Ancient trees, strange rocks, mountain peaks, and the shore, where the human world met the divine world at the sea. The beach was a misogi site, a purification boundary, a place where accumulated spiritual pollution, kagare, the residue of contact with death, birth, illness, and moral transgression, could be washed away by the ocean. This was not metaphorical. The salt water physically removed the pollution. The waves carried it away. During the summer festivals descended from the ancient Shinto practice, communities and aristocratic entourages would journey to the coast, the white sand beaches of the inland sea in particular, not for recreation, but for purification. Men and women, separated by woven grass screens, would wade chest deep into the breaking surf at dawn. They stood in the freezing water, clapping their hands to summon the attention of the kami, reciting long prayers while the waves broke over them. This is not a comfortable experience. It was not meant to be. Purification wasn't supposed to feel like a spa treatment. It was supposed to feel like something was being removed from you, because something was. After the dawn purification, the mood lifted considerably. The aristocratic nobility of the Heian court, one of the most aesthetically refined cultures in human history, a society that developed the world's first novel and treated the appreciation of beauty as a moral obligation, turned the beach into a stage for one of the more charming games in the historical record. Kyokyusui, the winding water poetry game. Courtiers in multi-layered, brilliantly dyed silk robes. The Heian aristocracy wore sometimes 12 layers of robes. That's a lot. Each color coordinated to the season, settling along the natural channels of the tidal flats. A lacquered cup of sweet sake was floated downstream, and you had to compose a complete, structurally correct waka poem referencing the specific scenery in front of you before the cup reached your position. If you managed it, you drank the sake. If you failed, you faced social humiliation, which in a court culture that evaluated human worth almost entirely on aesthetic sensitivity and poetic accomplishment was not a minor thing. Lady Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote The Tale of Genji at roughly the same period, describes these kinds of waterside poetry contests with the same breathless social anxiety she brings to the court drama, because they were court drama, conducted outside, in silk, with sake floating towards you on the tide. The Far Eastern beach day, taken as a whole, offers something genuinely alien to the Western coastal imagination. It's quiet instead of loud, inward instead of outward, and the goal is the dissolution of the self into the landscape rather than the assertion of self against it. Where the Greeks swam to prove something about human excellence, the Chinese scholar sat with a hookless line to prove that he had stopped needing to prove anything. Where the Roman built a heated saltwater pool over the sea and filled it with expensive fish that he could hand feed with gold leaf, the Heian courtier floated a cup of sake down a tidal channel and tried to write something true about the light of the water before the cup went past. These are different answers to the same ancient question. What are we doing here, at the edges of something so vast? And they're different enough from each other and from our own answers to be genuinely worth sitting with.
Now, the Etruscans. If you don't know much about the Etruscans, you're not alone. They tend to get squeezed out of the ancient world narrative by Greeks on one side and Romans on the other, partly because Rome eventually absorbed and, to some degree, suppressed the Etruscan culture. The Etruscans were dominant civilization of the Italian peninsula for centuries before Rome became the Rome we know. At their height, between roughly 700 and 400 BCE, Etruscan city-states controlled most of central and northern Italy, traded actively with Greece and Carthage, and produced art, music, engineering, and a coastal culture that their contemporaries found simultaneously fascinating and deeply disturbing. The disturbance was largely about gender. The Greeks and the early Romans had built their entire social architecture on the principle of strict gender segregation in public life. The symposium, the Greek drinking party that was central institution of the aristocratic male social life, was for men. The beach, as a civic and athletic space, was for men. Women appeared in public primarily for specific religious functions, and even then under careful regulation. The Etruscans operated on entirely different premises. Etruscan women of the wealthy class were literate, could own property independently, attended public events including athletic competitions and theatrical performances, and reclined with their husbands at banquets rather than sitting modestly at the foot of the couch, as Greek women did when they appeared at banquets at all. Greek and Roman writers found this so bizarre and scandalous that they assumed Etruscan women must be prostitutes, because what other kind of women would behave this way? The answer, which the Greeks and Romans couldn't quite process, was all of them. That's just how Etruscan society worked. The Etruscan coastal festival centered on Nethans, their ancient trident-wielding god of wells, fish, freshwater, and the sea. The figure who could later be partially absorbed into the Roman Neptune. During the height of summer, the warm Tyrrhenian shores of the place like Pyrgi, Tarquinia, and Volsi transformed into extended outdoor festivals that went well into the night, lit by enormous bonfires of pine and olive wood that also served as lighthouses for incoming trading vessels. Robed augurs, the Etruscan priestly specialists in divination, offered libations of wine, honey, and milk directly into the surf and read the flight patterns of coastal birds to forecast conditions for the remaining sailing season. Etruscan augury was so sophisticated and respected that the Romans, after conquering the Etruscans, kept the tradition alive and hired Etruscan augurs to perform the same functions for centuries afterwards. You conquer the people, but you keep their religious specialists because you're not sure enough of yourself to do without them. The most visually striking evidence we have for Etruscan beach culture comes from the painted tombs of Tarquinia, particularly the tomb of hunting and fishing dated around 530 BCE, and the tomb of the leopards. These underground burial chambers were painted with detailed, vivid scenes of aristocratic leisure that show us exactly what the high-end Etruscan gathering looked like. The colors are astonishing. Deep ochres, brilliant blues, strong greens, and the figures are painted with an energy and expressiveness that feels almost modern compared to the formal conventions of Egypt or early Greek art. You see men and women together on banqueting couches. You see musicians playing aloi and lyres among the guests rather than from a performance area. You see athletes competing, divers leaping from the rocks into stylized water full of painted fish and dolphins, birds being hunted from small boats. These paintings were made for the dead, meant to surround them in the afterlife with an image of the good life they'd lived. And the good life for the Etruscans looked like this: mixed company, music, food, wine, sport, and the sea.
The beach setup itself was a substantial engineering exercise. Large wooden platforms were built on the sand to stabilize heavy bronze and wood couches, which were then draped with the embroidered textiles featuring complex geometric patterns and stylized animals: panthers, griffins, sea monsters. Massive canvas sails dyed in saffron yellow, Tyrian purple, and sea green were strung between cedar poles to cut the wind and create shade. The dyes themselves were significant. Tyrian purple, extracted from the murex snails, was the most expensive colorant in the ancient world. Using it for beach awnings was a statement. It said, "We have so much of the most expensive thing that we can use it to keep the sun off while we eat oysters." The activities were lively, participatory, and loud. The older wealthy guests reclined and drank unwatered wine, a practice the Greeks considered the height of barbaric lack of self-control. I say, do it.
Drink up.
But which the Etruscans clearly found reasonable. The youth danced wildly on the wet sand, high-energy dances involving athletic leaps and the theatrical gestures, all timed to the music of the sabulo, the Etruscan double flute player. The sabulo didn't sit apart from the crowd. They walked among the beachgoers, their instruments decorated with silk ribbons that caught the sea breeze. The Etruscan musical culture was unusual in the ancient world for having professional musicians who were genuinely integrated in social setting rather than performing separately. You see, this kind of sounds like a hippie festival.
It does. I want to go.
I kind of want to go too. It sounds like fun.
It does sound like more fun than some of the other ones for sure.
Oh, very
Rather
much so.
than fishing with a straight hook.
Yeah, oh, God. That one still sounds so damn pretentious. There are accounts of Etruscan craftsmen working to the music, of athletes training to music, of ritual slaughter performed to music. The beach was just another context where music was the connective tissue of social life. The Etruscans swam without the Greek anxiety about it, and without the Roman ostentatious display. They were strong swimmers who treated the Mediterranean as a playground, diving from rocky outcroppings, racing in the surf, swimming out to the outlying rocks to rest before swimming back. Their tomb paintings show this with obvious affection. The diver images in particular having a graceful, joyful energy, muscular figures arching backwards off of cliff edges into curling stylized waves filled with leaping dolphins. The dolphins were significant. Dolphins appear consistently in Etruscan art associated with the sea, and they were understood not just as animals, but as guides, benevolent spirits of the water who escorted souls across the boundary between the living world and whatever came next. An Etruscan diver leaping into the dolphin-filled water was leaping, symbolically, towards something transcendent, though they were probably just having fun. The beach dice games do deserve a mention, because the Etruscans were seriously committed gamblers. Groups gathered under the shade canopies around intricately carved dice of polished bone, ivory, or amber, wagering loudly and enthusiastically while spectators gathered to watch and comment. Etruscan dice have been found by archaeologists in significant numbers, and they're beautiful objects. Small, precise, sometimes inscribed with the Etruscan alphabet rather than dots. The wagering was real and occasionally substantial, and the emotional register of these scenes, as depicted in tomb paintings, is frankly recognizable. The guy who's winning is exuberant. The guy who's losing is studying the dice with a look of someone trying to understand where it all went wrong. The food was abundant and emphatic. The whole wild boars on iron spits back from the dunes, the smoke of roasting pork fat mixing with sea air, bronze platters of garlic steamed mussels, baked sea urchins scooped from their shells, octopus marinating in sharp vinegar with wild coastal herbs, thick spelt bread for soaking up juices. The Etruscans had a sophisticated food culture that the Romans would later partially absorb. The Roman culinary tradition of combining sweet and savory, of using fermented fish sauces, of preserving food as a form of social spectacle, owes more to the Etruscan precedent than is usually given credit for. A high end Etruscan beach feast was the template for what the Roman villa dinner would become, except that Etruscans did it with more music and without the political backstabbing. All of the knife play, I swear.
Et tu, Brutus?
Et tu, Brute? Or at least, presumably, less of it. The Etruscan beach day was, in the end, the most straightforwardly joyful of the ancient coastal cultures. Not burdened by Greek austerity or Roman competitive excess, or the sacred obligations of Egypt or the Far East. Just a loud, colorful celebration of being alive and having enough money to do it well, in good company, with good music, at the edge of a warm sea. The Romans, when they absorbed the Etruscan world, took the template and amplified it to something almost unrecognizable. But honestly, like most things Romans adopted, the original was better.
I want to go hang out with the Etruscans.
I want to go hang out with the Etruscans too. That sounds like a blast.
That sounds like a blast. And then there's Baiae. The Etruscan beach was a party. Baiae was a party that had completely lost the plot, blown the budget, collapsed the moral framework, and was now floating in a heated saltwater pool on a gilded raft drinking wine chilled with a penny snow, arguing about whether to have the flamingo tongues or the sow's udders stuffed with sea urchins, and the answer was both. Baiae sat in the volcanic Gulf of Naples, in the Campi Flegrei, the burning fields, a geologically restless zone of hot springs, sulfurous vents, and occasional minor earthquakes that the Romans found useful and atmospheric in roughly equal measure. The natural thermal springs made the coastline uniquely valuable. You could build a bath complex here that tapped directly into the Earth's heat, which the Romans did, repeatedly on a large scale, creating a sprawling network of domed bathing halls whose ruins still stand, though partially submerged, in the bay. Baiae was also in the late Republic and early Empire, where everyone who mattered went in the summer. Julius Caesar had a villa there, Pompey had a villa there, Cicero had a villa there, and complained bitterly about his neighbors' parties in letters that somehow both 2,000 years old and completely relatable.
I don't know. Cicero can kick rocks. I still hate this guy. Fuck this guy.
I agree. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, all of them made Baiae their summer base. The town was, for roughly 2 centuries, the seasonal capital of Roman power, which meant it was also the seasonal capital of Roman excess, Roman scandal, and the Roman architectural ambition. The official occasion for the midsummer rush was the Neptunalia, a 2-day festival held in mid-July, and at the most dangerous heat of the Italian summer, when drought was most feared and the city of Rome was at its most unpleasant. Hot, crowded, smelling of the Tiber, and several 100,000 people. The prescribed way to celebrate the Neptunalia was to build umbrae on the beach, temporary huts of freshly cut pine branches and leaves where families camped out in fragrant shade, picnicking and drinking and letting the sea air do whatever the sea air could do for them. This was the popular, accessible version of the Roman beach day, enjoyed by people who couldn't afford a maritime villa but could still get out of the city for a few days and sit in a leaf hut on the sand. That doesn't sound half bad.
It's not terrible.
I still want to hang out with the Etruscans.
I do too.
It's a genuinely charming image, and it's easy to forget that it existed alongside the grotesque excess of the senatorial class doing the same holiday on an entirely different scale 50 meters away. For a wealthy senator, a successful general, or an emperor, the beach was an engineering project before it was anything else. The Romans had discovered by the 1st century BCE that volcanic ash from the region around Puteoli, Pozzolana, could be mixed with lime and aggregate produce a hydraulic concrete that's set underwater without dissolving. This was a revolutionary material, and the Romans applied it with the enthusiasm of people who had just discovered something that let them build wherever they wanted. They poured foundations directly into the sea, they constructed artificial islands. They built jetties and fish ponds and swimming pools and entire villas cantilevered out over the water, hovering above the waves on concrete pillars sunk into the seabed. The Villa Maritime on the Bay of Naples were engineering marvels, and also statements of intent. The sea was not going to tell a Roman senator where he could build. The sea was going to have a marble-floored dining room constructed over it and to serve as a view. A typical Baiae day started late, because everyone had been up until well past midnight. The beach was a simultaneous catwalk and political arena, and the stakes were high. Roman social life at the elite level was a constant performance of status, alliance, and subtle threat, and the Baiae compressed all of that into a narrow coastal strip where you couldn't avoid anyone. Men and women wore Koine silk, a translucent fabric woven on the Greek island of Kos that became effectively invisible when damp, which, at the beach in high summer, was immediate and inevitable. The poet Ovid described Koine silk as a fabric that reveals everything while seeming to cover it, and the Stoic moralist found it infuriating, which tells you that it was extremely fashionable. Seneca, who had strong opinions about this kind of thing, wrote with evident distaste about seeing people of both sexes at Baiae essentially naked in garments that technically qualified as clothing.
You know, this is where I am fascinated by these textiles. I really am.
Need a whole episode just on clothing.
No,
What
just
people
like
wore and
the
when.
textiles. I need the textiles.
You combine it with the clothing.
I mean, I don't care if you
'Cause
wore
have
it. I don't care if you wore it,
Fair.
to be fair. The Romans didn't swim for athletic training in the Greek mode. They swam for display and for cooling down, floating on their backs in warm water or lounging on the gilded wooden rafts that wealthy villa owners kept moored offshore for exactly this purpose. These rafts were equipped with silk canopied beds, low tables, and a continuous supply of wine, Falernian, and the prestige vintage of the Roman world, sweetened with honey and chilled with snow brought down from the Apennines by a relay of runners specifically employed for the purpose. That seems excessive.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping wine cold in the Italian summer before refrigeration was genuinely difficult and expensive, and the Romans did it anyway, because that was the point. The point was to do the difficult, expensive thing. Seneca tried to rent a room at Baiae to do some quiet writing and produce one of the greatest complaint letters that antiquity has. He describes enduring the ceaseless sounds of drunkards singing on the boats at all hours, rowdy parties wandering around the beach with torches at midnight, the constant splashing of show-off swimmers in the public channels, vendors shouting in the street, musicians competing for attention on the promenade. He eventually gave up and left. But his letter is invaluable because it describes the Baiae beach from the perspective of someone who found it genuinely awful. And the details he includes, the sausage vendors, the fake perfume stalls, the street performers, the permanent ambient noise, gave us a picture of the beach that's remarkably similar to the modern seaside resorts, which is either comforting or alarming, depending on your perspective.
Seneca sounds like so much fun at a party.
Definitely a wet blanket.
Imagine
Definitely
going
a
to
wet
the biggest beach party ever and complaining the whole time.
blanket. I know some people that would do that.
Right?
Yeah. The Piscine, a private saltwater fish pond, which has a very unfortunate name, deserve special attention because they represent one of the stranger features of Roman luxury culture. Wealthy Romans were famously, intensively devoted to their fish. They bred moray eels, red mullet, turbot, and sea bass in massive engineered ponds that required constant maintenance. Fresh saltwater exchange and specialized fish keepers. The red mullet in particular was prized to a degree that looks, from the outside, like collective madness. A single large red mullet could sell for the equivalent of a skilled laborer's entire annual salary. Roman writers mocked this obsession even as they participated in it. Pliny the Elder noted that certain wealthy men were more affected by the death of their favorite moray eels than by the death of their slaves, which, disgusting. A tour of the fish ponds was a standard part of Baia's social visit. You walked the stone paths above the pools. Your host pointed out individual fish by name, explained their habits and temperaments, offered you the opportunity to feed them. Sometimes the food contained edible gold leaf, because why not? You selected which fish would be served at dinner, and then you went and ate them. The intimacy of this, naming your dinner, feeding it gold leaf, watching it swim around for an hour, then eating it, is genuinely strange. But it was apparently very Roman. The evening's banquets at Baiae were the defining social events of the Roman summer, and the food served at them was calibrated to demonstrate the maximum possible reach of the empire. Oysters from the nearby Lucrine Lake, which the Romans had artificially engineered into massive oyster bed by cutting a channel into the sea. Parrotfish livers. Parrotfish were caught in the eastern Mediterranean and transported live to the bay in seawater tanks on specialized ships. Flamingo tongues, which required catching and killing a large number of flamingos for a very small amount of food, which was entirely the point. Sow's udder stuffed with sea urchins, a dish that combined two expensive ingredients into something whose appeal was entirely the expense of combining them.
None of this sounds appetizing.
It sounds disgusting.
This is the worst seafood banquet I've ever heard of.
I heartily agree. Ugh. Everything drenched in garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans put essentially on everything. I put that shit on everything. Made from fish intestines and salt left to ferment in the sun for months.
Ew.
Garum was Rome's umami, its MSG, its everything seasoning, and the best grades of it were extraordinarily expensive and traded across the entire empire. The Baiae dinner table was, in effect, a map of Roman power. Everything that empire could reach and extract and transport and transform, piled on silver-chased couches under oil lamps whose light danced on the dark waters outside. Gross.
That sounds disgusting.
It does. As the sunsets of the Tyrrhenian, the miles of maritime villas lit up simultaneously with tens of thousands of lamps, their reflections turning the black water gold. The whole coastline looked, according to several sources, like a city on fire. Which is appropriate, because Baiae was eventually swallowed by the sea. The Campi Flegrei is a supervolcanic system, and the coastal lands has risen and fallen by meters over the centuries due to bradyseism, slow volcanic ground movement. The villas slid into the bay. The fish ponds are now underwater, archaeological sites. Divers can swim through the ruins of the rooms where Caligula planned his bridge of ships and Nero plotted his mother's murder. The marble floor is still intact under 30 feet of Mediterranean water. This, as we mentioned in the introduction, is the most poetic possible ending for this place.
So what does all of this actually tell us, taken together? The beach has always been a place where cultures reveal themselves, because the shore is a genuine threshold between the familiar and the unknown, between the controlled and the uncontrollable, between what you've built and what you haven't. And every culture we've looked at brought its own deepest assumptions to that threshold and lived them out on the sand. The Egyptians brought the divine into every moment at the water's edge, because the water was divine, and being in it was being inside of the most important story their civilization knew. The Greeks turned the shore into a proving ground, because they believed that civilization was something you had to earn repeatedly against the indifference of the natural world. The Chinese scholars sat with a hookless line and tried to want nothing, because Taoism taught that wanting was the source of suffering, and the water was the best teacher of that lesson. The Japanese courtiers stood chest-deep in freezing surf at the dawn to wash away the residue of being human, then composed flawless poetry before a cup of sake drifted past, because beauty and purification were, in the Heian thought, aspects of the same thing. The Etruscans invited everyone, played loud music, jumped off cliffs into dolphin-filled water, and had a genuinely good time, which is underrated as a cultural achievement.
Achievement unlocked.
Enjoyed yourself at the beach. The Romans built a city of excess on a volcanic coast and watched it slowly sink into the sea, which is the most Roman possible ending. And the Phoenicians looked at the horizon and saw not an edge but a road, and followed it to places no one else had been. The beach, it turns out, has always been the place where culture gets weird, where the things you really believe about nature, about the divine, about the body, about pleasure, about what it means to be excellent or free or alive, come up to the surface and show themselves. We go to the water and we can't help it. We reveal what we're made of.
If you like what you heard today, please leave us a positive review on whatever platform you're listening to this on. It goes a long way towards appeasing the algorithm gods and getting the show in front of other history nerds just like you. The more we can connect to our people, the more we can keep this thing going.
We also have a Patreon where you can hang out with us, get exclusive content, and watch us attempt to make ancient recipes and just being dumpster fires. All for the price of a latte a month. Research materials and books are expensive, and this show takes a lot of time to put together, so anything you can contribute genuinely helps.
As always, we can't wait to see you again, and thank you for listening.
Thanks again. Bye for now.